Hello, everyone. I am a Millennial Mike, and with me I have Dan. I'm from the Exiles Network, and as you know, Dan's from the Reason I'm Broke podcast. And we have a special podcast episode today, a merger of sorts, which is very appropriate since we're going to be talking about some things in regards to Warner Brothers and Disney. So we have a really interesting podcast. This is going to be kind of different than what we've done before. Be putting it up on my platform, and Dan will be putting it up on his. And we got like a really interesting format. So I'm really excited to get into this podcast today.
And first, I want to give a huge thanks to Mike, because this wouldn't have happened unless he put up this skeleton of an idea on the Discord, in which I'm like, Mike has these great, you have a way of thinking outside the box when it comes to, this news story about this merger of Disney Plus and HBO Max, and then you bring out the bigger picture out of that. So I just want to make that clear to the Brokettes and to the Exiles Network listeners that this wouldn't have happened without Millennial's willingness, but also his straight up input on Discord of how this is part of something bigger, and it's part of a historical trend that has happened with Warner Brothers. So huge thank you to you, Millennial.
Hey, thanks again, Dan. And I always appreciate Dan's more straightforward and like feet on the ground kind of look. I get a little bit in my own head sometimes. So I think that both of our sensibilities are going to really come together and offer a really interesting public service announcement for you guys. So we actually haven't really so much thought about what this discussion or this podcast is going to be called, but basically the idea is that there have been some massive changes around Warner Brothers and Disney. And I would argue that they've been probably happening. We can kind of talk about that as we get into the podcast, but they've been happening probably ever since like 2016, when Batman v Superman was in production / being released. There have been shifts that have been happening, and maybe even before that have led to large scale changes in the industry around comic book movies and other large IP related films. And the idea today is to talk about all these different changes, kind of culminating in some of the latest news that we've heard lately, which is that Warner Brothers, HBO, and Disney's Disney Plus services will be coming out in a bundled format very soon. This is official news, and in the show notes. And many of you guys may have heard about this, but what you may not have heard about is some of the ideas that perhaps I and Dan have had, and maybe a few others have had, that this might signify some larger changes with the brands, with the companies. So we have this 9-part podcast, the 9-part kind of discussion that we're going to have. We'll go through, I'll name each part. I'll introduce it. I'll have Dan kind of add his thoughts in, and then I'll kind of respond to it, and we'll kind of go back and forth, whatever kind of works out the best. And we'll kind of come to the conclusion in the end of what we think this kind of news means for the larger industry. But before we begin, did you have any like other kind of introductory thoughts that maybe you had, Dan, about?
No, this is perfect. I think it's going to give us a good idea once we look at historically what's been at play over these past years, things that I think a lot in the movement, in the Snyder Cut movement, have overlooked. By the end, I think we're going to have a pretty clear conclusion that I think you outlined and pointed out pretty clearly on Discord, but it's fun to actually unpack it all.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get into part 1, the changing landscape of Hollywood studios. So we've seen like a shift in Warner Brothers and Disney, and how, at least I've seen, Warner Brothers has kind of focused on creative freedom and directors, like the auteur, like we like to call them. These are kind of words that I feel a lot of people in the Snyder Cut fandom have used, but I want to expand on these even more, because the Snyder Cut fandom, while I really appreciate, they've done a lot of great work, and I really appreciate what they've done. I think that there are even higher level things going on. Like the Snyder Cut fandom represents something, especially in the beginning. They explicitly stated that they represented what they believed to be kind of like a bastion of artistic integrity, right? Now, of course, it was extremely directed directly at the director, Zack Snyder, because his directorial vision was being challenged by the studios in one of the largest, most kind of public ways that we had seen up to that point. So I think that now that the whole Snyder thing is over, we don't really see as much dialogue around the Snyder Cut. It might be Rebel Moon or it might be something else now. But I still think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about the subject. And I still don't think the issue has ever really been solved. And in fact, it's probably gotten worse. And we'll talk more about those details. But on our show notes here, we have a list of DC movies and DC producers that have had their shot at the DC brand going all the way back to the first DC movies to ever come out, like in the 60s and forward. So from your experience, maybe having watched these movies or just kind of in your own head, what's been the landscape for you when it comes to directorial control and how that affected the movies over the years for the DC brand?
One thing I noticed, that speaking from experience as a child growing up on the Keaton Batman movies, as a kid, I did not notice, nor did I care, that there was this vast change between Batman going into all the way through Batman and Robin. But now looking back, seeing the struggle between producer, director, big studio and artist, that happened once already. And I'm sure it's happened tons of times before this, but just looking at DC, it happened with Tim Burton as he did his Batman, did Batman Returns. The Batman Returns was pretty problematic because they did let him, it sounds like they let him do what he'd like, and it ended up being more twisted, I think darker even than the first Batman film. And there was that infamous thing of, we can't sell Happy Meal toys, of Penguin when he's talking in the movie like, there's the pussy I've been looking for, when he's saying things like that. So they shifted radically and they told him he needed to change for Batman Forever, at which point he did not do Batman Forever, went to a different director, and that same director went on to continue the studio notes and the mandates into Batman and Robin, which he infamously said, he apologized for Batman and Robin, but he said, Joel Schumacher said that he was told he needed a certain number of vehicles because they had toys to sell. They needed different costumes. So at some point, so it's like we saw this change, this loss of vision once before. And as a kid, again, I did not care because it was Batman stuff. But now all of this reminds me a lot of what happened with the DC universe, except it was on a larger scale, because we got that hands off, let the artists do what they want with the Nolan films. I think for the most part, I'm sure there was some intervention, but it wasn't as bad as when we got all the way through into Justice League. And at that time, yes, I would argue in the Nolan era, even in the Man of Steel era, that was a no longer a creative freedom type of studio, especially compared to some of the other big ones like Fox or Disney, especially Disney. But now it's vastly changed with this change of hands, with this panicking, with essentially the bottom line being affected in their eyes. They decided to go with a much safer approach, which is why we have what we have today. So that's kind of what stuck out to me as I looked at this list of movies, because before the Tim Burton example, it was kind of the Wild West for comic book movies. It was more of, does the studio care enough to make a movie? And they weren't so concerned with how many toys they could sell at that point, not like they are today. So that was the main thing that stuck out at me when comparing it to what happened to Zack.
I was looking at this list and I was trying to think and trying to challenge my own beliefs, because I can say things sometimes quite hyperbolically, as anyone can when you're just reacting out of emotion. And I'm trying to justify the things that I say and the things that I believe. My thought was always, okay, DC is the dark, auteur, director-driven brand. And I've always thought, like, okay, is that really true? Recently, I wrote an article and put it on my Substack called Pop Culture Wars, where I kind of broke down a lot of this discussion about how the culture of these comic book movies and other large IP-based movies changed over time. Some of the tentpole movies that kind of had an effect on perceptions and things like that. And what I've noticed is that, okay, so earlier, like in 1960s, you had your silly Batman. In 1978, you had Superman which was very kind of indicative of the times. It wasn't so much that it was silly or lighthearted necessarily. As a matter of fact, there were serious moments in that movie, and compared to other comic book movies at the time, or TV shows, it was actually comparatively, more serious. So there wasn't really anything to compare it to so much as it is now. Like the difference now is why we feel the way that we do about DC, not so much back then. Then you have some movies like in the 80s, which, again, it's still kind of campy, but they took themselves seriously in certain ways. You still have a few Superman titles on there. The Supergirl movie, I have not watched that movie in long enough of time for me to really comment on. Swamp Thing, from what I recall, was kind of campy, but it wasn't ironic, which is, I think, something that needs to be made a distinction between. There's a certain sincerity that are inherent with all of these movies.
Yes.
In the 1990s, I would say that all movies in general, the culture of that time, were a lot more daring, a lot more edgy. So it wasn't just superhero movies. And I think that DC movies naturally benefited from that because particularly Batman, right? Batman, that's kind of his character in the comics, as it always was. So it allowed Batman to be what he actually is, right? And then that legacy went forward with, obviously Catwoman, which, quality aside, it still had kind of a darker tone. Batman Begins, Dark Knight, and Watchmen, which is a completely different beast. Even at that time, it was ahead of its time. So, and then in the 2010s, the first DC movie that came out in the 2010s after, well, let's see, I forgot to put Man of Steel in here, which was actually 2013. Batman v Superman was 2016.
Yeah.
So I didn't put it in this list for whatever reason, but I remember them. So those are there. But there was a lot of articles, actually, at least one or two that I can remember, that were talking about, and I hate to be like controversial or like that, but they were calling like Batman v Superman like a Trumpian era movie. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cringe. But I thought about this. I think that,
well, were they
like,
right?
all the specifics aside, right? All the specifics aside, there is a certain uncertainty and insecurity in 2016 and forward that people had because of things that were going on, right? So regardless of the specific individuals involved, I think that the movies that came out after that really reflected this, not so much in that they had the insecurity, the uncertainty, but that they actually wanted to create this irony, this like, oh, you thought things are going to be serious, but actually they're not, and I think DC particularly doubled down. Now, Disney was already kind of doing this with Avengers and whatnot beforehand when Joss Whedon came in, but I think that the culture kind of started to shift, particularly at this time and going forward. So I would actually say that some of those articles were correct. Now, their particular feelings and opinions on it, I'm not going to comment on that, but I do think there was something to that. And then 2020s is just a continuation. I don't think anything has really changed since 2010, to be honest. I think it's only kind of doubled down in that respect. But what do you think about that analysis of it? Like, do you feel like that's kind of, it hits the nail on the head, or do you think there's some things that maybe I got wrong?
People always bring up that in 2001, the world changed after 9/11, which included films. Do you think that without 9/11, we know for sure that things like Batman Begins were influenced by that change? It seemed like movies got a lot more realistic. It's kind of like the world got real, after 9/11. Do you think that might have played a role in the direction that a lot of these movies started taking?
That's a great question. I think, and I'm not some acclaimed philosopher or anything, but I do think about these subjects. I feel as though there's one idea that says during hard times, people make art about their struggles to reflect what they're going through, to cope, as a means of catharsis. People want to see other people going through similar struggles, to know that they can also make it through. That's always been my personal philosophy. That's why I like Zack Snyder's work, is because it's like saying, hey, we're going to make these movies realistic, dark, and uncertain like your life is, but we're going to show these characters pushing through, right? So that shows you, hey, this is a model, a template that you can actually apply, and you can feel as though in the real world you can make it. Whereas you have like a more cynical kind of MCU approach to it, where it's like, this version of escapism is a version where we presuppose that the world isn't like yours, so that way you can basically drug yourself out of your own reality, and then when you're teleported back to your own reality, you feel terrible because you wish you were watching movies again. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It doesn't really complement your real life struggles. It kind of dulls them, Now, I'm not saying that doesn't have its place, but those are the two philosophies going on here. And so you would think, okay, you have the 9/11, you have big, a lot of political upheaval in 2016. Right. And then in 2020, with all that had gone on with the lockdowns and the riots and all this political upheaval, you would think that even more political upheaval would cause even more of this realistic kind of grounded takes. But in fact, it was the exact opposite. And most of the time that you hear people talking about escapism, they're not talking about seeing someone deal with your issues and being able to relate to that. They're talking about complete denial. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, especially now. That's especially like I have my films or my movies that I escape for. I'll watch something that is completely unrelated to my life, and it's not a G-rated movie, but something like American Psycho that I can watch for pleasure, because to me it's a dark comedy and I can escape into that and laugh and all that. Mm-hmm. So there is its place for it for sure, like you said, but it seems like the audience that gravitated towards the MCU wanted complete numbness to the reality around them. And I almost feel like maybe they couldn't or they wouldn't relate to the ongoing darker, more mature themes that were established reestablished again by the Nolan era of movies, and that got it into the audiences. As soon as they were introduced to the other side, junk food cinema, whatever you want to call it, that the MCU provided, they were like, oh, that feels better, so I'm going to go watch that. That's quote unquote fun. That's what I want. And for me, I related more to the DC films, and I'm not a part of these other countries either, but I noticed that those DC movies were more popular internationally, places like India, Latin America.
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you the single fact that unites all of those things, what you've noticed and what I've noticed. This is the difference between 9/11, post 9/11 and post 2016. Post 9/11 united people together, whether that's a good thing or not, right? I'm not saying making a qualitative statement. Right. I'm just saying it's the way that it is, right? Post 2016 divided people. Post 2020 make people paranoid. Okay. So people don't have any belief in anything, So it's like, if he believed, okay, this terrible thing happened, I'm going to fall back on this belief, this philosophy that I have. They're still operating within the real world, right? But now I think people are so disassociated that they want their movies to be kind of disassociated. And a lot of people have distrust in the authorities, distrust in institutions. And they especially, because the idea that, what I've noticed is that in 2016 and forward, Hollywood writers and the whole machine, the way that they write, quote unquote, sincerity, quote unquote, seriousness, down to earth, deconstructions, all these sort of things that are good narrative things to do. They've taken all these concepts, and the way that they've advertised them is they've kind of used them to target big portions of their audience, if not their entire audience altogether. They're basically saying, hey, we know how the world ought to be, and this is the way that you need to take it. And it's just kind of doubled down on the divisiveness. So a lot of people just dislike it because they feel attacked. And then the other portion of people who don't necessarily feel attacked, they feel cynical because they know that it's not authentic. They feel like they're being kind of like pandered to, or it's kind of just like, it's just not authentic, right? And that has seemed to cause a lot of what we've got going on here. So whenever someone sees like a serious down to earth take, an Oscar baiting movie or whatever, they think pretentious, they think, bloviating or patronizing or things like that. And when Zack Snyder in 2016 makes Batman v Superman, and it includes, this kind of montage, this reel of different media outlets talking about the situation, it's very kind of like real to life. Instead of realizing that Zack is actually kind of on your side, like he's basically saying that all this overwhelming amount of information makes things more complicated in the real world that we live in. People look at those sort of things and they just think, oh, you're just trying to make me feel a certain way. And they lump Zack Snyder in with all the other directors who are legitimately trying to do that. That's my take, at least.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there too. And what do you think of this idea of sort of wrapping up what I was trying to say with these other countries that relate a lot more to Zack's films? Is that the MCU obviously captured the Disney fan. They all went out and saw this. And it's something I noticed while working at Disney. I did work for Disney for a few years, and seeing the customers and even seeing the fellow cast members, is what they're called, the workers, is that they have this attitude of optimism that I found at that point of my life to be very difficult to witness, like, because I was unhappy in various ways. So when I saw that that fan base has that going on, and I've had my share of traumas as a child and growing up, to where I naturally gravitated more towards things like Batman as opposed to Spider-Man, because I guess I related more to these themes. Do you think that that's why Zack's movies are so relatable in these other countries? Not to say that the U.S. hasn't gone through its struggles, but I mean, compared to the struggle you'd go through in Central South America, or again in Asia or wherever,
or India, or
exactly,
something like that,
they probably relate more to these films because of that. Do you think that that does happen, where if you're a little more cynical, you might relate a little bit more to these films like Nolan's or Snyder's?
Well, that's a good question. I'll tell you what I can say, and then I'll tell you also what I don't think I can answer as of yet. So to kind of wrap up what I was saying before, and which might tie in a little bit to what you're talking about now, the things that we went through, with we quote unquote, I'm not sure who's listening to this podcast, but 9/11 in 2016, 2020 is mostly like Western, like United States kind of stuff. So the same kind of sensibilities that people have always had, or the kind of culture that hits the US and then kind of disseminates, trickles down to other countries over time, might, like, for instance, like India, for example, might still be in their like Tim Burton stage for all I know. That's going to happen sometimes because, like, a lot of culture hits the US first, naturally Hollywood's there, and then it kind of disseminates other ways. And that's just like the globalist culture. Now, obviously, each individual countries, they have their own culture as well, which I can speak less to. And let's answer your question. Basically, like, what I will say is, I won't say that like everyone else who's not in the United States is living in some sort of poverty-stricken squalor or something like that. But what I will say is that in the West, in the United States particularly, I do see this sort of like purposelessness and cynicism because of, I do think it's kind of like a suffering from success thing. Like, for the most part, if you look at the numbers, which I don't have on me, but I'm speaking both anecdotally as well as from facts that I've heard and believe to be true, but don't have on me at the time, is that there is a large portion of people who are doing quite well, right? And then there's a very low bottom as well. There are people who are doing quite bad, but it seems that there are a lot of people who are doing extremely well, like compared to history, right? So I think that, and everyone has access to a lot of just basic things that we didn't have. A lot of people have access to internet, whereas at one time we didn't have it. Communication and other, not that that's a basic thing, but the quality of life is pretty high on average. Now, there might be numbers that say to the contrary. I'm just speaking based upon my own worldview and what I understand to be the case. And I don't think I'm the only one to say this. So if we're going on that assumption, it's possible that in places where the quality of life isn't as high and that more struggle is inherent to everyday life, people's kind of like flatline, like kind of where they are at on average, is different. So like when they see someone struggling, it's not actually like dark to them. It's not actually like harrowing. It's not like a big thing. You know, that could be a situation. I don't know. Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Yeah, this is something that I thought of as we were looking at how these movies changed so much when it came to, like, we're looking at the bigger picture. It's like, oh yeah, it was kind of like, again, doing their own thing. And then suddenly Batman Begins and The Dark Knight and Watchmen and BVS and all these other things that are like, yeah, something definitely changed there. And I think it's just kind of fun to think about, looking back, all the things that have affected cinema. Had 9/11 not happened, would we have gotten something like Nolan's trilogy ever greenlit? Like, it's just kind of interesting how things could have gone as well if you look at the full picture.
Yeah. And before we move on to, like, let's kind of bring in a little bit, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about this later perhaps, but let's bring in Disney's kind of style. So I think that we have an idea that Disney is kind of like a producer-driven studio. And I agree that that's currently how they are. But I do kind of recall a time that Disney did actually represent artistic excellence, you know, particularly with their animated films, you know, all hand-drawn. And they represented some of the best animation that the world had to offer, even encouraging Japan to then go on to kind of create this booming anime industry, right, in the early years. And then later on with Pixar, you know, they created this large, you know, budget animation machine that created works that united people, both young and old, while offering poignant and meaningful themes about life and everything in between to the masses, while also keeping a very high production value. And everyone liked them, you know? So Disney, they did so many good things. And even if you want to get into the MCU days, early in the MCU, I can't say that it wasn't promising. Like, I did enjoy Iron Man 1. I enjoyed the first Hulk movie. I mean, I enjoyed more than that, but looking back at it, I can say that I like those movies and they were pretty decent. And if they stayed kind of that way the whole time, then I probably wouldn't have as negative of opinion about Disney as I do now.
And we got to remember those were Paramount and Universal.
That's correct. They developed and produced them at those studios, but they were kind of released through Disney after the buyout, right?
Avengers. Once Avengers happened, that's when the buyout happened. Even Captain America was not a Disney movie yet. That's why I really like First Avenger. That's my favorite one.
Yeah, that was a really good one. And again, this isn't saying that I didn't like some of the Disney MCU movies, because at the time I did. I was also a lot more willing to, and I was willing to accept and make myself like things that maybe I otherwise wouldn't have liked. But they had kind of later on had kind of a more producer driven model, which I think we're probably going to end up talking about in later parts. So how about we kind of move it along, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later.
Sure.
But part 2 is impact of directorial vision. And to say that there's only been a handful of directors to shape all of cinema is actually great. It does not. Obviously, there are many famous directors throughout theatrical history who kind of shape what we have. But we have this sort of situation where large IPs. So I would say, like, from the time of like, you know, probably like late 1970s, 1980s, like the blockbuster film, right? Mm-hmm. Going forward, there were names in the business that kind of shaped our perceptions of what the blockbuster movies look like. And other people made blockbuster movies as well, but oftentimes we talk about a handful of them. And I think that some of these that we're about to talk about will be significant in our discussion going forward. So I have a few ones listed here, like Michael Bay, James Cameron, Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, Tim Burton, Zack Snyder. Who's the most famous one? I can't believe I forgot to add him on here. My brain is blanking out.
Like Steven Spielberg?
Yeah, Spielberg. Yeah, Spielberg. I would definitely probably go on this list as well. But are there any of these directors that you have any specific thoughts on as far as like how they had an impact on mostly IP filmmaking?
I think all of them have had like have left their thumbprint on what a modern blockbuster is, and for good and bad too. Some of these I don't like quite as much, and some I do. Like James Cameron, for the most part, not for me. Especially the recent Avatar movies. They're not movies that I enjoyed, but I understand why people like them. I think they're great for the general audience. It's got a little bit there. It's easy to follow. It's got spectacle. It's easy to understand. It's not challenging the audience too much either. And he gives you a familiar story with those Avatar movies. So it's like you put it here. It's the popcorn movie perfection. That's the one that's going to bring in billions of dollars. So that one obviously popped out at me, and I grew to respect Michael Bay a lot more recently in the last 5 years, ever since the Zack Snyder stuff happened, because all the things that I've seen thrown my way over the years over Zack Snyder, I've heard people say about Michael Bay, and they're very different directors, but they've both kind of challenged what movies can do and what they are in different ways. And I think they are high on style, which is amazing, especially when it comes to action films. And it's one of those things where I can grow to respect these directors, even if I don't watch or enjoy every single one of their movies. I think the three that I respect the most from the list here are Chris Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, and Zack Snyder. The movies they have made more or less fit with what I enjoy. More often than not, I will buy their movies to rewatch over the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I added Michael Bay, for instance, on here because I think that when it comes to a personal taste, that is absolutely subjective, and that's fine, right? And just because someone is an auteur, right, or they're a visionary, quote unquote, does not mean that you have to like them. But I feel as though if I'm willing to say that Zack Snyder is a visionary, is an auteur, which I definitely believe that he is, then that would also extend to Michael Bay. And I agree. In the beginning, I wasn't really that way. But then later on, I recognized this. And this is mostly when I started seeing the complaints against Michael Bay that were also very similar to Zack Snyder. Some of those complaints were like, this is like bro cinema. People call it bro cinema, or they have issues with both of their portrayals of women, which I would argue that if you actually wanted to make that argument, Michael Bay probably, like, that might actually have, if any, have more legitimacy to that argument than Zack. But I don't have any problem with either of them, to be honest. Another complaint would be like, explosions, which basically is just to say spectacle. They didn't like the fact that it was the movies were very spectacle focused. They use a lot of slow motion. They have a certain cool factor to them, right?
Yeah.
So, like, that's kind of like what people complained about Michael Bay. And all of this is just to say he was, quote unquote, style over substance. And that's the same thing that they say about Zack Snyder. So when I started hearing all those complaints, I'm like, okay, he has a very unique style. Like, no one makes explosions like him. And in a lot of ways, he's kind of like James Cameron. James Cameron also has kind of like some of the cool factor down. The reason why I like James Cameron is because he takes the blockbuster popcorn movie idea and he does like perfect it. Like he pushes the boundaries. He pushes the technological aspects of it forward. If you're going to make like a popcorn movie that isn't supposed to make you think, it's not supposed to make you want to rewatch it, then you might as well make it as spectacular as possible. That doesn't mean making it more efficient. Like on Disney's end with the MCU, it's just a conveyor belt. All the movies are just okay or less.
Yeah. And
they all feel the same, and none of them push the boundaries of anything except for how many people can we sign a contract to get in the movie. Like that's the only kind of achievement that they really attain. So I think that James Cameron, well, I personally, like you, he's not my favorite. I respect that he actually is trying to elevate something instead of just perpetuate a status quo, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because he could have easily, he didn't have to give it 110%. Even Avatar, I can say that there's effort behind it, even if it wasn't for me. But it's a very distinct difference between that and Avengers 2 or whatever that also made $1 billion. And you can see that there was more care taken in Avatar than in what the MCU did.
Right. You know, it's fun. And Cameron spends, I know Cameron also finances all, or in some cases, big portions of his movie. And that's also important too, because he has more creative say, both over the direction, the writing, and the overall production of the movie. And it's more of like a singular effort with him, his team, his VFX guys, his people, you know? So it's still his product. He has a pipeline. Whereas the producer driven pipeline over at Disney, while you could argue it's the same, the people who are most in charge of making the final product aren't the people actually directing the movie.
Right.
You know, there's a difference when you have an actor director or a director making a movie, because they have skin in the game, basically. I mean, I guess the producers do too, but it doesn't hit the same. Christopher Nolan, I wrote under him creative license, a license to be creative. And the reason why is because he can't lose. You can't scrutinize this man.
Right.
And what are your thoughts on Christopher Nolan and why he's been able to get away with, for instance, like The Dark Knight, while other people can't seem to get away with pushing the boundaries with Batman in any way? Or if they want to make a Batman movie, it ends up just being a pale imitation of what he did with Batman.
Nolan's such an anomaly because he does, like you said, he has a license to be creative where he can get away with, I want to make a movie about this original idea, not based on an IP, 3 hours, IMAX, and then people go and see it. And people go and watch it and they like it. And it's not, and he does have polarizing ideas in there. He has things in there like Tenet that are higher concepts or Inception, things that the general audience should not really like. It doesn't sound like something they'd be interested in, but they'll come out for it. And I think it might be because he also ties in that spectacle into it. Out of all these directors, some might say Michael Bay, but I think Zack Snyder is closest to Nolan because Nolan does have spectacle in his films, not at the same level as Cameron or I will even say Snyder, but he does have that in there, that wow factor. He pushes like he did with Inception, with the IMAX cameras, with The Dark Knight as well. And he elevates the medium. I think that's another common trait that some of these directors have is they will elevate it. But Nolan just happens to make these films that, for whatever reason, I haven't thought about it enough, the general audience likes more, maybe are challenged a little less than some of the other directors, but he hits that mark. And producers seem to like him. Universal likes him. They're like, yeah, come on over. Makes, what was the most recent one? Oppenheimer. Ends up being another big hit, and that probably proved to them, like, yeah, we made the right decision signing him on, and let's give him another blank check for his next project. And then that one's going to do well as well, and audiences are going to come out. So it's just amazing how Nolan, I can't think of too many directors like him that are both elevating it and not staying safe, like maybe Cameron might be in some ways, and still make a good amount of money to fund his next project.
Yeah. I would say part of it is that he makes movies not based on IP, right? Except for The Dark Knight, which is an exception, but The Dark Knight also came out before 2016. So all of the different issues that we talked about before culturally didn't have an impact on him. So that's a big reason for it.
And he made it his own. It's almost like it was so different than any Batman comic, or I know some people point to Year One, but Batman Begins going into Dark Knight. Dark Knight is so different than Batman Begins and some of the Batman IPs that it was almost like Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. It wasn't DC's Batman. I'd say it was more Nolan's. that's how much he changed the mythology and the ideas behind it and grounded these characters so much to where they wasn't your traditional Joker anymore. It was like an Elseworlds tale. And I think that's why, even though it's based on an IP, it's kind of like, well, Nolan twisted and changed it so much that it almost doesn't count as like an IP.
Yeah. What I would say is that Christopher Nolan, for me, represented a time where just making a movie with extremely high production values was enough. Like, I feel like for instance, 2008, when The Dark Knight came out, that at that time, there weren't really enough superheroes out to where you started to get to take them for granted. If someone made a Batman movie with as high a production value, Hans Zimmer's on the score, and the effects, the practical effects, I mean, everything is just so pristine as it was at that time. Most people were really kind of played off as just, oh, it's another movie, and I'd rather, I would leave some production value for some more, I don't know, nostalgia or quote unquote comic book accuracy or some other kind of nebulous kind of little nitpick. They would be just happy to receive their Batman character in high fidelity, high production value glory. Whereas later on, people started to become more cynical about things. And now it's just not enough to make a movie that looks great. Like the MCU pretty much dispelled that. Like they made 20 different movies up till Endgame that all looks just kind of the same,
Mm-hmm.
And, you could go to Ant-Man. It looks just about as good as Avengers Endgame or Infinity War.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, don't you think that Infinity War should look like a million times better? But
Right.
they purposefully made everything look kind of the samey, so that way you didn't get whiplash when you watched the one movie to the other.
Yeah, don't make it too good.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Christopher Nolan, he's definitely an enigma for sure. Denis Villeneuve is interesting. One of the things that is interesting about him is that in 2017, he made Blade Runner 2049.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Later, he made Dune 2, which came out this year. And both those movies have basically the same budget, and they have the same runtime as well. There's a 2-minute difference in runtime. But Blade Runner lost money. It lost quite a bit of money. And Dune 2 made money. Now, there's a few differences here. One difference is that Blade Runner 2049 was an R-rated movie, but the original Blade Runner 2049 was also R-rated. Sorry, the original Blade Runner was R-rated. And later on, we saw movies that were R-rated that made plenty of money as well. Right. So it's interesting to see that, 2049, it was critically and audience acclaimed. And Warner Brothers still turned around and gave him tons of money to direct Dune 1 and Dune 2. And this, mind you, the original of 2049, this one was directed in 2017, 1 year after Snyder got heavy pushback and eventually later was kicked out of the DC project during Justice League. So and he actually made money on that project. So I found it very interesting that, Denis is kind of allowed to fail. Do you have any ideas on why this is the case?
Yeah, I don't really, because Blade Runner 2049 should have been, and maybe, I don't know, I haven't seen any interviews with Denis or if he had projects that were turned down because of how 2049 performed. That should have been a nail in a coffin with the way Warner Brothers was acting. Like, okay, well, you're no longer going to get these high budget movies anymore. The way that they treated Zack over the reviews for BVS is how Denis should have been treated after 2049, except he actually lost money, or it didn't make as much, I guess. I don't know if it actually lost any money based on the budget and marketing, but as to why there's that difference, I'd have to look at the producers. Were there different people in charge during 2049 than BVS? When did, do you happen to know when 2049 came out? Was it around the same time as BVS?
It came out in 2017, a year after.
Right around that same time.
It came out when Justice League came out, and it came out a year after BVS came out.
The only thing I could think of is that they saw Justice League and they saw, okay, there's Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman. These are massive characters. They should make $1 billion. That's our Avengers. Whereas Blade Runner, they're like, oh, maybe they looked at that as, okay, it's not Batman. It should have made more, but they weren't as taken aback by that failure as how BVS in their eyes should have performed when they got all three characters on the big screen for the first time.
The common narrative, particularly amongst people who agree and are supportive of the idea that Zack was kicked out, is that Marvel's success up till that point made Warner Brothers feel as though their main IPs, their main comic book IPs, needed to make at least as much money, which, I can't necessarily refute it. But what I will say is that I don't really necessarily think of these studios as being very principled. I always try to think of, they're just trying to make money. They're trying to make money, but they always prove you wrong. They always prove you wrong. And it's like, they do different things at different times. And perhaps there are things or numbers that we don't see. There are factors that we haven't considered, but there are many times, like right now, they're making DC movies, multiple of them, that are flopping, that are losing money at the box office.
Yep.
And yet the people associated with those movies aren't losing their jobs. In fact, they're getting promoted. So
what's an example of that? Because I know Dwayne...
Well, James Gunn being the massive, which we'll definitely get to.
Yeah, I think he's the big one, of course. But like Dwayne, not to contradict you, but Dwayne Johnson lost out on his... I guess he was going to head up DC Films in some way if Black Adam was going to be a success. They were going to continue the Snyderverse without Zack, quote unquote, the Snyderverse. And he then returned. I don't think Blue Beetles or whatever thing, because James Gunn promises he'll return. I don't know if it's probably another lie from him. But so far, like Patty Jenkins hasn't gotten a return after Wonder Woman 84. I think as far as I know, James Gunn might be the only one. And I don't know if they make that the exception because his film happened to come out there in COVID, but even though it was a massive flop.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I kind of feel like the reason why Dwayne didn't get his thing is because of how vocal he was. Like I feel like, because with James Gunn,
he did hype it up, didn't he?
yeah. That's kind of the reason why I feel like he kind of clashed with some people. And you could say that about James Gunn, but the thing is, he only became vocal after he got promoted. It's funny. We're going to talk about this later, but the circumstances by which James Gunn infiltrated into the Warner Brothers DC universe is absurd, and I think it has far-reaching implications. But in regards to the Denise situation, I think that I personally can't find a way to really reconcile it. I mean, I can make up ways. I could just say, the company expected this. Like, you could always say, like, the reason why making money is not good enough is because they expected more. Like, that's a goalpost moving kind of situation that you can only speculate on. And that kind of speculation, that open speculation, it really favors people who agreed with the decision. So they can basically kind of just say like, oh yeah, like, they needed to be good. It wasn't good. That's the reason why even though it made money, because it wasn't good or because they expected more or something like that. It's not really a satisfying answer. And it doesn't ring true, especially into later events. But I have let's see here. I have Tim Burton and Zack Snyder on this list as well. Let's not talk so much about Snyder because he has like whole parts here dedicated to him.
Sure.
Tim Burton, we kind of talked about him a little bit. He was kind of a result of the 90s getting to play around with the characters a little bit more and being more open to making like a stranger and darker storytelling. And I think he's kind of like the first DC director to start getting us the perception that DC was allowing their creatives to do things, Did you have any other like further thoughts on Tim?
I think it was in that era where they weren't sure almost that even though it's Batman, Frank Miller, I don't know how familiar you are with comic book Batman as far as his
Batman
sales.
Returns, The Dark Knight Returns.
It brought Batman back in a big way. And so did Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil when they took a darker take on the Batman characters. But that was the start of it. Like, that's what sparked a lot of this. is Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. They brought back the Joker after years. Believe it or not, the Joker was not a mainstay villain for Batman comic books, and Denny and Neil brought him back into that A-list Batman villain type of role. And he was, of course, during the Batman show in the 60s. But when they brought him back and they made him into this murderous, insane, dark character, it really elevated the villains for a lot of people. Then you got The Dark Knight Returns, took him into a darker place that people weren't used to. Like, even though Denny and Neil Adams went there, but it went even darker with The Dark Knight Returns. And then Tim Burton came forward, and his sensibility is naturally darker, gothic type of storytelling and characters and designs. And he applied it into Batman at the perfect time, where that's exactly what the character needed more of. And it was a massive success. And unfortunately, and I already talked about it a little bit, but that ended up being a little too much for Warner Brothers at the time. And they wanted, like, well, the kids are watching this, we need to sell more toys. So yeah, I kind of took that churn there. But yeah, I think he's a good addition to it. His movies have obviously changed a lot over the years. I don't think he's the director he once was, but he definitely had his moment in the DC history for sure.
I think it was in 2016 he did Miss Peregrine's, what was it? Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. That was in 2016. That was the last movie that I think was as kind of dark as it was. And ever since then, he was doing Dumbo. He did Wednesday, but Wednesday is kind of more of like it's like a ironic dark kind of thing, So yeah. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into our next part here, because we have several parts left to go. So let's go ahead and get into part number 3, the factor. So I always said, and I know others have felt this way in the Snyder cut movement and other people who enjoy like these kinds of films, but I've always felt that Zack Snyder had represented not just his own design or his own brand, but a larger idea about what creative control over an IP could look like. Christopher Nolan made 3 Batman movies, and those Batman movies really represented his idea, but those movies were very isolated to really just his character and maybe a few other antagonists and some other like side characters that I wouldn't say those portrayals are really like necessarily the comic book portrayals that a lot of people wanted to see, but they were there and they worked for. I would say aside from some of those exceptions, his movies are pretty isolated in regards to the full pantheon of DC characters. But to see a director like Christopher Nolan have control over not the entire franchise, but just a piece of that franchise so that he could create, he could use all the characters as he needed and create, kind of an epic, a saga, if you will, that abided by his sensibilities. That is kind of one of the elements to Zack Snyder that I thought was what was more compelling than just, oh, I want all DC movies to be like Snyder, like some might say that I want, but that's not actually really necessarily true. It could have been someone else. Now, do you feel that you have a similar idea, a similar take on this? What do you think that Zack Snyder meant for what DC could have looked like that doesn't have anything to say about his style specifically?
I think we'd have to point out that I always try to remember that Man of Steel was originally, and it almost was filmed to be like a part of Nolan's universe. They really wanted Nolan to take on Superman and make him a part of the Batman Begins universe, the Nolanverse, to the point where the character was written to be an older Batman, very much like how The Dark Knight Rises ended. And even concept art for BVS showed the Nolan Batman design going up against Superman, the Man of Steel. So for Zack, I think because Nolan handpicked Zack to helm that moving forward, it feels like he continued what Nolan was going to do, but he almost made it into more comic book accurate than what we would have gotten with Nolan. Even Man of Steel, I would say, would not have fit as well in a Nolan verse as it did in Zack's universe. He really put his own thumbprint on it. So I think for Zack, it was this perfect marriage of comic book accuracy and elevation, whereas Nolan took it further into, we're going to really change the basis of this character. Zack did that while retaining familiar elements of these characters, even the looks of these characters, giving us the New 52 Superman. So it was kind of like, it's almost like a what if. Now, I'm not even going to compare it to the MCU because I don't think the MCU is comic accurate to itself even, but this is as close as you get to, like, again, going back to the Frank Miller's The Dark Knight of, here's something familiar. It's Batman, but it elevates it, it changes it. And I think that's what Zack represents. It's this perfect balance between comic book and realism that Nolan gave us. He hit that balance perfectly, whereas other directors chose not to, and that's fine.
Yeah. I have so many things to say about this part. The first thing that I would say is that what Zack represents to me is two things. So at the time, it was like an idea of like artistic integrity or directorial vision in an IP, right? That's what I was thinking of at the time. And then later on, I thought more about it, and I realized what it really was that I was craving, what it was that I wanted. I would say that there are four things that I wanted, and most of these things were to establish this one fact, which is to allow DC to be a viable alternative to Disney. And honestly, what you'll hear me a lot of the times not use the term MCU or Marvel, because I love Marvel characters. I like Marvel comics. I did, at least. And I don't really view the MCU that way. I view it as a Disney product that first and foremost, and they use Marvel characters. But I think that Snyder was the only one offering an alternative philosophy to the style in which these movies were made, the philosophy behind the movies entirely. And this is categorized in four different ways. The first way is to have a movie with an individual director whose vision is responsible for the story from beginning to end. The second thing is a meaningful, forward-looking, close-ended story that is free of unnecessary spin-offs, self-reference, or franchise baiting. Okay? The third thing is enduring films. So films that you can watch again and again and have lasting value that aren't like kind of pigeonholed in a certain time and place, with high production value that are quality in and of their own merit. And then if you do those three things, the fourth thing that you get that just kind of comes naturally is a unique and stylistic saga with characters that take themselves seriously throughout the entire story without resorting to irony or subversion. So those are like the that's like the tent pole, like boom, 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 boom. That is what I think Zack Snyder getting to play in the DC universe meant. I would have been happy if he could have finished his 5 movies, and I would have looked forward whatever else DC was doing, because I felt like, okay, he came in, he did something. He actually did something. Whereas a lot of these MCU directors, they come in and all they're there is just to further the status quo, just to further the Feige agenda, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't really seem appealing to me. Whereas a lot of people watch those movies and they recognize that Feige is basically the one that's directing it, and they like it because of that reason. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much that the Disney way of things is the wrong way to do it, which I do actually think it's the wrong way to do it. Yeah. But that it's an alternative philosophy to the way that it could have been.
Yeah, and I think that was what appealed to me the most when you said that, because I hadn't seen it often said where, or even presented in this way, that Zack Snyder was like almost this antidote to Disney, is I think how you put it. And I'm like, that's absolutely true. Like, while I may think and enjoy that the fact that Zack's movies are very different and almost the opposite of what Disney does with the Marvel characters, it does represent, as you put it, and that's what fascinated me the most, is it represents this idea that is completely the opposite of the way you make films. It's not the way that Disney does them. It's completely different. And that's what made it dangerous in many ways for, I think, producers. They saw that Disney's way of doing it was, they said that's the successful way to do things. And instead of recognizing that they are a different path completely. Now they'll say that. I see all these fucking comments now of DC should have just done its own thing. And I've heard that throughout, even while the Snyder Cut fight was happening. But that's what they were trying to do for a while there is, but during those years, they were saying they should do it more like Marvel. How come these characters don't have their own movies first before they end up meeting each other? And there was a lot of that going on at the time, but after the fact, now they're trying to say they should have done things the way they were trying to. It's so disingenuous to me that shows that they never cared how these movies were made. They just didn't want them to happen.
Yeah, I think that, see, in a world where DC and Marvel are as similar as they are, then I think it's easier for vocal minorities of people online, which I'm not saying I'm not a part of a vocal minority. I am, right? But for another vocal minority online, they can say, oh, DC needs to do its own thing. It needs to be the same, be the same, and try to like create this narrative where they can't win one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But in a situation where DC legitimately creates a viable alternative, because like, okay, there's a thought that, oh, the only way for DC to succeed is if they copy the MCU, right? But what I'm trying to say is, no, DC needs to find a way to make an antidote to DC whilst being successful.
Yeah.
They almost think to be good because they aren't DC or they aren't Disney.
Right.
And honestly, I think that Zack's plan, like maybe it wasn't perfect, but this is kind of my suggestion, or this is kind of my justification for why it could work. So I think that he was going to make like a 5-movie arc, Man of Steel, BVS, Justice League 1, 2, 3. Mm-hmm. Now, with that idea, that sounds pretty reasonable. Okay. 5 movies is not a long time. You could, if you planned it in advance, could have a movie every year for 5 years. If you want to go 2 years between movies, at most, you'll have a 10-year saga. Okay. Which is, pretty reasonable. And I think if you do it this way, the amount of movies you have, it's short enough to where a studio can commit. Like if I was a director and I came up to the studio and said, I want to make like 20 movies like the MCU did, I want to direct all of them, and I have this like plan. I've written everything out and I want to do it. I mean, that's never going to happen in any universe at any time. It's short enough to where a single individual could reasonably just sit down. He could pen the entire script, for all the movies, fill out any gaps, any plot holes. It could be a cogent, thing that just works perfectly together as one story. Like we all know the MCU didn't plan everything out in advance and then execute. Like it was a lot of play by ear, a lot of kind of figuring out what people want as things go along. And then it kind of just happened. But the opposite of that is to actually having final product with the end in view, completed and ready to go, and just execute. That creates a product that is completely different than what Disney was doing. And then the last thing is that if we did it this way with the family arc, it will be long enough so that you could use, if you use efficient use of the time, you could make an epic story like in the vein of Lord of the Rings, and you could have this epic kind of saga, this epic story that utilizes all the DC characters. And, in worst case scenario, it breaks even, like the whole project, all 5 movies break even, or maybe you even lose a little bit, but at least at the worst case scenario, it's over. It's only 5 movies and you can go on to something else. So I feel like that was a sweet spot they could have hit. What do you think about that?
Well, the wild part is he had a built-in reset point, and it required more than 5 movies. It would have required Green Lantern, Cyborg, and then The Flash is where it would have ended. But that's where he had that built in. That's going to be Flashpoint, something better, as he said, something better than Flashpoint. And that was the reboot, because by then the actors, it would have been 2020, I think was when The Flash would have come out, 2022 maybe. And then DC could continue with that same Barry Allen, and Flashpoint would have happened, and it would have reset the universe into a self-built new 52 make whatever movies you want now. And Zack would have been out, Ben would have been out, whatever. They all would have been done. If you want to have them back in some kind of crossover, massive type of other movie 20 years down the line, then that can happen. But otherwise, that plan was built in as an exit. And they just didn't trust enough in it. That's the problem is, if they had just continued going in the same direction that they were and not tried to course correct, by now they could have had their, okay, here's our Battinson movie because we had Flashpoint already, so we can do what we want. But yeah, it would have required more than 5 movies, unfortunately. That's the only thing that, unless they wrote it into Justice League 2, but I think it would have, it's kind of hard to write Zack's Justice League 2. And
so
have
the Flash was supposed to happen before, after?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's good. That's a good question or a good point. I'm sorry. I mean, even still, I feel as though with 5 movies, it would be possible to create a saga and kind of have it wrap up in a reasonable manner. Now, it doesn't say that's what exactly he had planned to do, and we know that he did have David Ayer do the Suicide Squad. I apologize. Don't mean to insult David Ayer. So it's not like he didn't have other stories kind of in there. And I think that if you do it properly, you can have someone create a side story that complements the movies, but isn't required really to tell the main story. And what I'm really hoping to see is a situation where a creative can create something that has its integrity. You can watch it just like these movies and then it's over. Back in the day, there'd be a lot of trilogies. The X-Men had 2 different trilogies, and I guess you could say they had 2 different trilogies. Spider-Man, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy is one of the more well-regarded movies. Some people have complaints with the third one. I feel like that's actually kind of, people are coming around on that third one.
Yeah,
but
I got to make a correction. I'm sorry. You're right. Justice League was after The Flash, so 2018 would have seen The Flash and Aquaman, followed by 2019's Shazam and Justice League Part 2, and then 2020 would have had Cyborg and the Green Lantern Corps. Now, I don't know if that has had since changed, and maybe there would have been some kind of reset after that, but no, yeah, he would have done Flashpoint, but it sounds like it wouldn't have been after Justice League Part 2. It would have been before.
Yeah. Well, definitely ending it after Justice League Part 1 or Justice League Part 2, that definitely wouldn't have no, let me make sure I have my information correct. So from what I understand, it was supposed to be Man of Steel, BVS, and then Justice League 1, 2, and then 3. Is that correct?
So the way I'm seeing it was Man of Steel, BVS, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League 1, The Flash, Aquaman, Shazam, and Justice League 2. So it was originally just the 2 Justice Leagues. He hadn't split it up into 3 yet.
That's what because I've heard that it was supposed to be Justice League 1 and 2, but I also heard that it's supposed to be a 5-movie arc. So I know that there's at least 3 movies that we know were going to come out. But then what those last 2 movies are, I forgot exactly how that was supposed to. Maybe I could have been more prepared with that, but
we know now how 2 and 3 were going to be broken out, but I think it's because plans changed so much to where it became this bigger epic scale movie. Justice League Part 2 did. I think that's might have been what changed it, and I don't know when that would have happened. Probably after BVS, I'm assuming is when that change would have happened. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how. Man, I just really wanted to see Flashpoint, and we never got to see.
Yeah, no, that would have been amazing to get an actual Flash movie.
And I bet you that changed when Geoff Johns. Sorry, I know we're trying to move forward, but when Geoff Johns came on board, it's like, okay, we're going to use Flashpoint, and then when it turns out that Geoff Johns was who he is, that's when Zack. I know for a fact plans changed again because they then. At first, it was, it's going to be Flashpoint. And then recently, at Full Circle, he was like, no, it was going to be something better than Flashpoint. So I think that once Geoff did what he did, they said, let's get rid of Darkseid's daughter. because there was a big rumor that she was going to be in one of the Justice League films.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get rid of, let's change Flashpoint into quote unquote something better. And Jeffrey Dean Morgan even confirmed that he would have been Batman and we would have gotten the female Joker as well, Martha Wayne Joker. But with Zack changing all of that, I'm fascinated to think of what changes he made so that it was as much not like Jeff Johns' story and more Zack's and David Goyer's or whoever.
Yeah. The funny thing is that we refer to it as Flashpoint because that's a well-known story. Mm-hmm. But we don't refer to Batman v Superman as Doomsday. You know, I think that it's plenty fair for there to be a quote unquote Flashpoint like event that has some kind of, it creates some sort of like ambiguity about where the universe, where the time, where the world could go after that, or maybe nothing changes, but then it creates another universe with which other directors could start making movies. So you have a situation where like, okay, the original universe, it begins, it ends, there's this Flashpoint like event. And after it's over, you know, we have like this satisfying conclusion, right? Where as far as like chronologically, it's all in one direction. It begins and it ends. But then that final event creates the justification for other movies to basically to take place in a quote unquote spin-off universe or an alternate universe. Mm-hmm. And if they just kind of did something like that, like imagine a universe in DC where every director, you give an esteemed director 5 movies. They can use all of the DC characters. They have to end the franchise in such a way where the universe the story is complete in some kind of way, or it gives justification for other people to spin off of or continue from where you left off. That could be really cool. It puts the creative control in the hands of the directors for a short enough period of a time where you can pivot to a different thing if you need to, but you kind of commit to something so that way you actually have the ability to make something that's complete. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there was ways to go about it for sure. And I think Zack was cognitive of that as he was building out his plan. And he even said that he never wanted to truly step on any toes, as leave it to them to make their movie, which is very different than what Disney was doing. It needed, as you said earlier, it needed to fit the vision. And Zack still, like Wonder Woman still fits the Zack universe and all of that in many ways, but he would have still liked to, he was very director and artist friendly, and it showed.
And there are ways of which we could have talked about ways other people could have gotten their hands in the pot as well. Yeah, there are a lot of ways that it could have gone, but that's just kind of the way that I feel would have been the best, because I do want to get that kind of epic saga feel, and I want one director. I like the idea of having a saga. You have a 3-movie trilogy. 5 movies is cool because you get an extra 2 to kind of pad it out even more. It's a little bit more. It's more long term. You can like look forward a little bit forward, and you have more room to play. Mm-hmm. But who knows? It's all speculation at this point. The next part here is part number 4, the marvelization of DC.
Current times.
Yes, now we're heading into current time. So as you know, in 2017, when the Justice League movie was released, I don't know if the news was released that year or maybe it was in the previous year, shortly before, but due to tragic events with Zack Snyder's daughter Autumn, he was forced out of the role of director on the Justice League movie, and Warner Brothers took the opportunity to replace him. Of all the directors they could have replaced him with, they chose the famed director from the Avengers franchise, that's Avengers 1 and 2, Joss Whedon, who was most well known not just for making those movies, but for setting the tone of the MCU up till that point. Yeah. Right? It's very much because of Joss Whedon's style and writing dialogue that the MCU and all the other directors who played in the MCU kind of were writing, Feige's like, hey, whatever Joss Whedon did here, everyone else does that. Like, that's what the MCU is now.
Yep.
And they brought him over after he was quote unquote let go. I mean, he kind of was. He didn't continue doing Avengers movies after the second one. He was let go and he ended up in Warner Brothers. So that's the first time that Warner Brothers and DC are picking up after Disney's scraps. And then later on, and this isn't to say that there weren't other movies that were also kind of aping the MCU Disney's style, but that was the first notable moment where it was obvious that Warner Brothers, through their hiring practices, were trying to make the DC universe more like the MCU. Later, the director James Gunn, most famed for the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, was put on after he was quote unquote fired from between the second and third movie for a few months, was then rehired, but between that time was promoted to director of The Suicide Squad, which is insulting from multiple angles because it basically apes the title from the first Suicide Squad, who was directed by director David Ayer, with the addition of "the," making it seem as though it's the more legitimate version of the two. And of course, he's a previous MCU director. And then later on after that, after the movie flopped, by the way, he was then promoted to president of DC, by which point he had detailed in an interview that he released on one of the journals. I don't have the link. We can put it in the show notes, that he had the producer Kevin Feige on the Warner Brothers DC set.
Right.
And that he had been talking back and forth with Kevin Feige about the Suicide Squad movie and other projects. And that Kevin Feige was approving of what he was doing over at DC and that he hopes the best for DC. That's Kevin Feige.
The competitors need to do well for us to do well. Like something like that is what he
saying. Something like that. So these are just some of the most notable examples. And then, of course, the final and most latest example is the news that Warner Brothers, HBO, and Disney's Disney Plus are going to be creating a bundle package where you can pay for one and get both very soon. I don't know the exact details of that, whether you'll have to download both apps or how that works. You'll get the content of one in the other app and vice versa. But these are all elements of Warner Brothers accepting and taking within themselves the Disney ethos.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about this whole situation? Are there other things that I may have missed? What can you comment on some of these events that have taken place?
Well, one of the things to note is for sure that history repeated itself. You mentioned that Joss Whedon set the tone for Marvel, and so did Gunn when he came out with Guardians. All those movies
afterwards were his.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. They all were like his movies. And Deadpool had a role in that too. I think that was a big influence as well, which was separate from all of this. But Gunn's all the movies now, I feel like, are closer to Gunn's movies than they are Whedon's. And for worse, I will add. Like, they're both bad directions, but they're even worse today. And so with history repeating itself, they went after the guy that also set a tone for Marvel, and they're doing it again, and they gave him an even bigger role. But he, very much like some of these better directors that get a pass for things, Gunn, for whatever reason, is able to get a pass on putting into DCEU canon Peacemaker saying things, even if it's not true in his world, that Superman has a poop fetish. That is not a problem, but Superman snapping Zod's neck is a huge problem. Like, it's something that builds into the plot of BVS, by the way, in a big way, that they do something with. And it's just amazing to me that this is another director that gets away with absolutely everything because he made a Guardians movie that people liked. I think that is the main difference, and that's why that he keeps getting a pass, is including from Warner Brothers, because all he does is he points at his movies over at Marvel and he says, look how much these made. Yeah, the Suicide Squad didn't make as much, but look at all these that I did make that did make over $1 billion.
It's not just that. I think that it's because James Gunn isn't sincere about his movies. Some people say that his movies have sincerity to them, but he can be outrageous. He can be as violent as he wants. Like, bad, negative, dark things can happen as long as it's not as long as it's ironic or quirky or campy or something like that, then it's okay. I don't think it's exclusively that he's an MCU guy. I think that's part of it. I think the optics are basically that DC recognized the error of their ways, and that is symbolized by them bending the knee, taking a quote unquote fired MCU director and placing him in one of the highest positions in their own franchise. It could have been anyone, really. It could have been Joe Russo. It's just like these dumb optics that no one truly cared about before. And a lot of those same people are criticizing Gunn for his decisions now. So it's not like they had any true allegiance to him. It's just the optics that DC recognizes their second place and that they need to, bend the knee, basically. Right. And again, it's just the campy, insincere, bathos-ridden kind of irony that are in the movies that allow them to be, what is the word I'm looking for? They're irreverent. They're irreverent. And they can say things about the characters in that way. Now, if Superman was literally doing some poop fetish stuff in his own movie, well, that might be different, I guess, depending on the context, but it's absurd, whereas Superman legitimately snapping someone's neck because it's his last case resort and everything is taken seriously. He's distraught about it. It's very sincere. People are forced to confront it at its own level, right? There's no snark. There's none of that. So I think that's the reason why he was allowed to do it. Look at the Shazam movies. Those are also extremely irreverent. Birds of Prey, also extremely irreverent. All these different movies that came out in the later half of DC franchise, a lot of them were very irreverent and they don't take themselves seriously. And that's why even if they fail, people still go to bat for them because they think that's how DC movies should be. They should recognize their own absurdity. That's what the critics say. And that's what some people claim that they want who dislike the way that DC has gone up until Snyder.
I'm glad you brought up that anyone could have taken that role, because now that you mentioned that, going back and looking at history, Michael DeLuca and Pam Abdy, remember they were trying to get Todd Phillips to head up the DC universe, and he turned it down. He said something like, "I'm like the third guy to turn it down." And then James Gunn was like the first one who said, "I'll do it." So what was he, like fifth pick or something? So that's the one thing that contradicts this idea that this conspiracy of this was a planned move to make DC into Marvel, like fully owned by Disney. That's the one thing that I think, but I have been hearing on X that Pam Abdy and Michael DeLuca were more friendly to the older sensibilities of the artistic integrity Warner Brothers. They're the ones who wanted to continue Zack's characters and actors. Their decision was to bring back Henry, even without Zack, unfortunately. But then when they moved on from Warner Brothers, that's when they're like, okay, now we're going to get James Gunn and he's going to do something completely different. We're going to scrap sorry, Henry, we just hired you, but you're fired again. And it's because of James. That's fair. I would say, okay, but this is the thing. Even if he was fifth pick, why was he a pick at all? Imagine going through like different producers, right? So you actually go to to people who have expertise in the production, role. And then you go to directors, okay? But they're directors inside of your own company, right? And then you go to a director from another company. It's like, why choose? If you're going to look at directors to choose to produce your movies, right? Why you would have a lot of options. Like any director who's ever directed a movie for Warner Brothers, not just DC, but for Warner Brothers, you could have gone to them. You could have gone to any director who's made a movie for any other studio, even Disney, but just not a director who was most acclaimed for making and setting the tone for the MCU. So the fact that he is fifth is still not a good excuse, in my opinion. Like, he was still on the list. And then on top of that, like, how do you end up in a situation where he gets a director's role and somehow Feige ends up on the set?
Like
he was wishing him luck, Mike. That's all it was.
I'm not going to cut them any slack. I mean, the fact that the first, so what are we going to like go back and retcon the fact that Joss Whedon was the first pick after Zack Snyder was released? Like, oh, he was actually the fifth pick. So it wasn't like they were trying to like MCUify the, like, come on. I mean, that might be a little bit like bullheaded for me to kind of say that, but I just kind of feel like if that were really the case, there are too many options before you go to James Gunn. And then don't forget this. He was recently quote unquote fired for very distasteful tweets. Okay, we'll put it that way. My thoughts on this are this. I personally don't think he should have gotten fired for those tweets. I don't particularly think the tweets were funny. And I think that when you try to use really extremely edgy humor, that you put yourself in the position to get pushback from people. So if fans were like, okay, we don't want to see this or whatever, and there was some reason to believe that, and they decided to fire him for that reason, then, I kind of get it, but I didn't really get the impression that he was actually like MCU fans would have 100% gone to see volume 3 of Guardians of the Galaxy, regardless of those tweets. Like, I think that all of that was kind of just a ruse to quote unquote fire him, to give DC the go ahead to hire him as a director and then later as the president. That's my thoughts, because it's too perfect. Like, okay, you get quote unquote fired for something dumb that you definitely shouldn't and wouldn't have gotten fired about under any circumstances, because MCU fans don't have principles. No one has principles when it comes watching their dumb superhero movies, you know? And then boom, director, boom, president, boom, Kevin Feige's on set. Like, and then boom, you get hired back to finish the,
yeah.
Like, no, that's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, would you say, at what point did you think that, so the Marvel, let's try to talk about the Marvel formula a little bit, right? So we talked a little bit about producer first filmmaking, a little bit about the 4-quadrant approach, basically the idea that you want to get all demographics, all age brackets, and different kinds of, demographics involved in the movie somehow. So that way it can appeal to the widest bracket of people. We have like check boxes and quotas, right? That's another big part of the Marvel formula, is to kind of, especially now. And then the idea that other movies are sincere. They're all kind of ironic in some kind of way. So that way it kind of escaped criticism. Like if they took one of the movies completely seriously, then whatever issues of the movie, you can't say, oh, well, it's not taking itself too, you can't really use that as a defense of the film. So with that said, do you feel like the Marvelization of DC had a purpose? Was it just for the fact that they were trying to make more money? Or do you think that perhaps there was something more to that?
Well, when you point out that it's all too perfect, especially with Feige coming on board, even if it was planned by Disney, because they would trade to any day of the week, they would trade the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and Deadpool for the DC universe. Like, you'd be stupid not to. I'd rather, keep all that, and we'll take Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and we'll cross them over into the Avengers. For that would and they've since talked blatantly about it. James Gunn has said, yeah, we've brought up that idea. So it's like, they're absolutely talking about it, and they wouldn't be talking about it unless it was possible in some form. Now that you mentioned how perfect it is, maybe it started off as, back in the BVS days, we need to make it more like Marvel because that's what people like. But it has since turned into, let's try to make it fit so as much as possible into the MCU, to the point where there were rumors swirling that Multiverse of Madness from Doctor Strange had a Batfleck cameo. That's where the crossover was going to happen. That's where the rumors began.
Yeah.
And now with James Gunn making his MCU in the DC universe, it would not at all surprise me if there was an MCU cameo in one of James's movies, whether it's Superman or something in the future, or if it sets up that crossover. It's going to happen. And whether or not Disney fully buys up the IP of DC from Warner Brothers Discovery is left to be seen. But that crossover is definitely happening now with James Gunn there. I truly hope Superman Legacy flops and that somehow magically changes things. I don't think it will. And I think that crossover is going to happen. I think that both the MCU and the DC Studios universe need that to happen for them to succeed, because they're both in terrible shape right now.
I feel like there are several things you can do to make a movie, to give a movie better chances. You know, you position it where there's no competition. You market it to where you appeal to the most amount of people as possible. And so basically, you know, you're marketing it well, right? I would argue that marketing it well meant that you're marketing it for the intended audience. But let's just say that you make the movie seem as kind of generally acceptable to as many people as possible. And then you also lower the budget. And I think that a lot of those are very possible. I think that especially after all of the divisiveness that DC has gone through, if they're making a new Superman movie, they're probably going to make it as milquetoast as possible, which means that it doesn't really have anything to say in one direction or the other. It doesn't have any strong directorial sensibilities. It's just basically to placate as many people as possible. And seeing the photo of that Superman that was just recently posted from the new movie, it looks like it's going to be cheap. It looks very cheap. It's very CW level, cosplay level production quality. So
they're broke.
If I were to assume that they're going to placate as many people as possible, keep the budget low, and then position it at the right time so that way it doesn't have too many competitors, it's possible that they could make the movie, it could at least break even, you know?
So you think it's deliberately set for success regardless? Make it as cheap as possible, release it. I mean, it's very possible that it ends up, it met expectations. Our budget was only this much. They'll spin it. They'll definitely spin it. But rest assured that my fucking grumpy ass is going to be like, no, it didn't make $1 billion, guys. That's what the benchmark was, right? $1 billion or flop. And this one has Superman and Hawkgirl and every fucking character in the DC universe. So I'll do my fucking part. But yeah, it's going to be set up to just like the Suicide Squad. It's not a flop. No, it is.
I think that the new Superman movie is, I mean, it still could lose money. And I don't think that breaking even is really an excuse anymore, especially if the idea is that they expect it to make, you know, because before Snyder's movies were always disregarded as being underperforming by virtue of the fact that it should have made more than it did. But now a movie can break even or lose money and it not be that bad because all these other extraneous factors. And I just think that it's all very disingenuous. So if it breaks even, I count that as a fail, you know, right. Especially when you have this much foresight. You have all this knowledge, all this data behind you to kind of know what people want, what they don't want. You know, apparently they know what people want, what they don't want. They should at least, right? I mean, that logic would dictate that.
Sure.
But with all that knowledge and opportunities and with as much writing on this as it has, with DC being in such a sunken spot for so long, I feel as though they have enough knowledge to force it to not fail at the very least. If they have to lower the quality of the product and just kind of like, you know, whore it out to everyone and just make it this general audience kind of just nothing burger, that at the end of the day, people look back and go, oh, that wasn't really that great. That's not hard. The MCU does it all the time. Yeah. You know, like people go see like Ant-Man and the Wasp and, you know,
they're forgotten
and stuff like that and just completely forget about that. So I don't know. We'll have to see, but let's go ahead and go into our next part here. This is part number 5 out of 9. So buckle in, guys. We appreciate. The great thing about this is we could actually split this up into pieces, you know, pretty easily if we needed to, or split it in half or something.
Well, a lot of this is overlapping as well that we covered.
That's true. We did overlap some things too. But I do kind of want to be comprehensive. So
sure.
There's not going to be any situation where you're going to be able to listen to this and then not like get the full, the full breakdown, all the lore. Part number 5 is producers versus director dynamics. Some of this is a little bit overlappy, I will admit. In this section, we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the producers. Now, to be honest, I was kind of like in the midst of a lot of the discussions around these movies when the upheaval in the producer ranks were happening, but I don't necessarily remember all the names of the people. I don't really, that's not really my thing. I don't care about that as much. I'm more about kind of the philosophy and the wide scope of what's going on with the companies and things like that, as opposed to the individuals. I think Dan will probably be more knowledgeable about some of this stuff, but there were a lot of changes that happened in DC. A lot less, I would say, than Marvel. Although Marvel had their own upheavals, there was that one producer recently who got let go due to like controversy or whatever. Although there was
guy.
It was that Victoria Alonso, was it?
Oh, that, yeah, I don't know. I don't follow the MCU too closely, but that was the last firing I remember.
But there was that one, and then I guess I don't know about the 97 guy, but there have been a few, and don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of people who've gotten kicked off of Marvel projects and Star Wars projects. A lot of that I wrote in my article, Pop Culture Wars, about, the directorial disagreements that Disney has had. And, Disney will promptly, swiftly remove someone, replace them, and the product still comes out relatively the same, because they have a penchant for doing that, and they also have a reputation of creating a certain kind of product that people want to see. So it doesn't really truly matter who they fire. People are typically on Disney's side when it comes to these sort of artistic upheavals, because at the end of the day, they're making the content, or they made the content up to a point that people wanted to see. So what can we say about the producers and kind of like how they had a hand in all these changes?
I think the ones that were most supportive of Zack's universe were Greg Silverman and Charles Roven. Greg's was active on X up, I think he might still be. Every now and again, he'll put up a post. But the one that he gets screenshotted the most of recently, I think he posted it last year, was this idea that people were saying of someone floated out the idea that Zack's movies were not successful, and that's why he didn't continue in the DC universe. And he, as a producer, went out on X and he's like, that's completely untrue. While we did lose a fair amount of money, he said it right there, he lose a fair amount of money on Sucker Punch and Owls of Ga'Hoole, the rest of his movies were incredibly profitable, is the way he put it. Very profitable. And even like BVS, I think or Man of Steel, one of the two, were the ones that made $100 million before it even released, just based on the marketing deals alone. So it's just kind of amazing. So these were people that are still pro Zack up to this day, and were, I think, the biggest supporters of his movies and universe. They're the ones who understood that, because you had a Sucker Punch, let's not get, okay, well, you don't get Man of Steel now. Like, it didn't work out that way. These producers trusted in Zack and his direction. Charles Roven, same deal. Although he stuck around a little bit longer through into Wonder Woman and eventually Justice League. But they're the ones that I think that I view back on, aside from Nolan, as like the era that would have given us the movies that we would have enjoyed. And then, we got the terrible ones like Geoff Johns and John Berg, who maybe Geoff can make great comic books, but he cannot do TV or movies. I'm sorry. It's just not his thing. And he proved that easily when he was put on in Justice League. And he'd been trying to get into the DC films since Green Lantern, and he wouldn't get in, and he found a way to worm his way in, and he didn't. He was another friend of Feige's who he was telling Feige everything, right? So he's another one that's probably pro, let's get a crossover happening. And now he's no longer involved. He got let go as well. And now you got Walter Hamada. I trust Walter Hamada, right? Wasn't that the hashtag, I trust Hamada?
in Hamada we trust.
That's it right there. In Hamada we trust. And that ended up being someone who was not at all in favor of what Zack was doing or the Snyder Cut or any of that. And now
the moment he got on, people were posting that, Now, of course, I've come to realize that a lot of the things that have happened on social media, I don't believe they truly represent, I guess, the average person. I feel like there's a lot of average people who just show up to movies and they probably make the majority. Not that the smaller, more devoted fan base can't be drivers of profit. I do think that is the case, but there are just a lot of people who just go to the theater, they look at the board, hey, I'll take the 6:00 showing for this, and they just go in. There's probably a lot of those people too who don't have to have a lot of context before, or don't have to be swayed necessarily, or their mind is already made up before they go in.
Yeah.
But yeah, so regardless of the Hamada we trust, I do think that he probably did have some creative differences with Snyder and the way he wanted to do things, which probably had some effects on the product. But go ahead. What else were you saying?
Well, outside of Hamada, who we were eventually the movement said, okay, we need to get rid of Hamada. And then he was fired, and now we ended up getting something as bad, or if not worse, definitely worse. Safran and James Gunn and Zaslav. I mentioned Pam Abdi and DeLuca and how they were in between Hamada and Gunn, that little era that they were in, where there was probably the most hope. That's the era where Zack posted that Thanksgiving picture of Crisis in the background. Mm-hmm. Some people say that we had gotten the return of Zack, but it hadn't been announced. But then with the exit of DeLuca and Abdi, that's when Zaslav made the decision of different direction completely. And then now we have Gunn and Safran. So ups and downs. It's a fucking roller coaster.
We're kind of in the era now of the producer-driven DC movie. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how long it has to fail before they go back to a directorial thing. I don't think that they ever will. I think that you can always, because the benefit of producers, and what I've noticed too, this is how Disney has always kind of done it, especially with the MCU and with Star Wars, is that if a movie is unsuccessful, if there's any controversy or whatnot, then the producer can kind of just throw the director under the bus, fire him, hire someone new, someone who has an exciting name, something that's interesting that makes headlines. And then people kind of get excited again because they're still in the mode to kind of feel like a director can change, move the ship around. So during times where things aren't going quite well, directors get their names in articles a lot more. Like you heard about Nia DaCosta recently and how, who was it? Who's the big exec on top of Disney right now? He basically said, the reason why
Robert Iger.
Yeah, we didn't have enough oversight on the set. So basically completely threw her under the bus, And Feige, of course, still producing these movies, nowhere to be seen. Franchise is just, hitting its stride and it's doing great. Then all of a sudden Feige is getting his name on all these articles as like, the architect behind the success that is the MCU. I feel like it's just easier for things to be producer driven because you can basically kind of you can the credit for the success of your directors, but then you can throw them under the bus when it doesn't work out your way. And I think that's what DC is going to do. Like everyone's got their focus on Gunn right now. But if Gunn does do well, then who's going to get the credit? It's not going to be whoever directs whatever movie that happens to get acclaim. It's going to be James Gunn.
Right. He's going to be the architect.
Yeah, he's going to be the architect. Exactly. So it's more of a fail-safe than anything from my perspective. And I don't think that there's any reason for them to actually bring the celebrity director back,
Yeah, and that's the era we're definitely in. It's a two produce. I've said it for a few years. We have two Disneys now. I said it when I worked at the comic book shop. We've got two more. Even their comic books started being run like Disney as soon as AT&T really started paying attention to the comic book publishing. We've got two Marvel Comics. We've got two Disneys right now, and fucking merger of streaming services, like you mentioned earlier. Literally one fucking company, and that crossover that's definitely going to happen.
Well, that crossover is a great segue into part 6, which is the Warner Brothers Discovery merger. So this is also kind of goes a little bit into the producer situation. So like James Gunn got involved later on. There's the partnerships with Disney. We talked about Feige, and honestly, we talked about a lot of these things kind of already. We didn't talk so much specifically about the Warner Bros. Discovery merger, which was at that time, Zaslav was on board at that time. Right? That's when he was brought on.
Yeah.
because he was the big exec over at Discovery when basically Warner Brothers came under that banner.
Yeah, he came over from Comcast.
What I always thought about that situation was that, people like the idea that he was like this businessman who focused only on success above all else, and that he would cut it if it didn't make money, period. And if it did make money, then he would continue it. Mm-hmm. And people thought that this pragmatic approach was going to ensure that we actually got things that we wanted.
Right.
See, I was never really on board with that, because this is the thing. I don't actually really care about if a movie makes money or not. I just want a movie that I enjoy, and I'd like to see a machine set up that would create more of those kinds of movies. Now, obviously, a movie does have to make money, and most movies that I have enjoyed in the DC franchise have made money. So it would be reasonable to assume that someone like Zaslav would create a situation where it's overall good. Especially once he cut the Batgirl movie and we heard about all the behind the scenes and everything like that was supposed to come out from that movie. Mm-hmm. It definitely didn't look like it was going to be good.
Yeah.
So what did you have any thoughts about Zaslav, or what was your thoughts on the merger in general?
I was on that camp. I'm that camp that you're describing, of almost my exact words. This guy likes money. We're fucking vocal as fuck about what we want to give them money for. He doesn't give a shit about politics or whatever is happening or whose vision or what. He just wants what's going to make him the most money. And that's clearly Zack Snyder. We know that answer, but Zaslav, turns out, was not interested in that. He's more interested in, I don't even know what you'd want to call it now, but maybe because it's underperformed so much. My conspiracy is that he wants to make Warner Brothers Discovery as cheap as possible for another company's buyout. So it's almost like an intentional sabotage. We've gotten plenty of sabotages already, but this is like the latest one, except on a corporate level. So that's what I think. I speculate now Zaslav is doing. But initially, I thought his intentions were, okay, let's try to get, because that's what he said, and I believe them. Let's try to get this company off the ground. We've got these great franchises, these great IPs. Awesome. And poof, nothing. And I thought the cut was great. That was a great idea. Get rid of Batgirl. I was like, yeah, get rid of that shit. Plus it represents the Michael Keaton universe that we don't want. And instead it's part of something completely different. His interests are not at all aligned with the movements. I was wrong about Zaslav.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I find interesting as well is how many people have gotten their hands on DC and who have realized that it's beyond saving. And it's happened so many times that I wonder what the curse of DC is. It's interesting. I think maybe it's this. Maybe it's that the DC properties had become so valuable that everyone who is even lightly associated with it wants to get their hands on the pie and are willing to screw each other over for it. And in the process of that, end up sabotaging the projects. Like Zack is working on DC, and people within the company hate the fact that Zack, or anyone who doesn't like Zack hates the fact that he is the one in charge of DC, one of the most valuable brands, on the planet. And they dislike that, anyone who has, especially 2016 and beyond, DC has the opportunity for massive cultural control, massive cultural influence. Because the characters have been iterated so many times, you can iterate these characters in very distinctly different ways and technically be justified in doing so. Whereas it's more difficult to do this with like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or something that's more specific. It has a linear story, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to have like this cultural influence, having a comic book franchise under your belt gives you way more cultural influence. So anyone who doesn't have the values or opinions or the sensibilities that you don't have, that's also in the industry along with you, they become kind of like a target to undermine and then try to usurp them. That could be the reason why DC has undergone so much problems. But see, Disney, they got their start, a whole phase, quote unquote, before DC really started with 2013 Man of Steel. So they already kind of established a certain kind of pattern. And you know how a ship takes a little while to change. So by the time 2016 rolled around, 2020 rolled around, they had some steam, but it's very possible that things are already changing within Disney by before like 2019 when Endgame came out. Things are already changing within Disney and they just hadn't manifested until later. That's also possible.
Yeah, that's actually absolutely true too.
All right. And I think one here, it's expectations and studio strategies, part 7. This is basically just discussing what do we actually want as the audience? What do we want? What are the studios? I mean, we know what they need is money, but sometimes it doesn't always seem like that's all that they want. What kind of reconciliation can we come to? And is there some kind of inherent misalignment between the desires of the audience and the studios? And what can we do about it? What's your philosophy on the subject?
This is probably the toughest subject to touch on because I have no idea what the audience wants. And I also don't think the audience knows what they want. They claim to think they know what they want. And when they're given that thing, they don't show up for it. So it's not what they want. And I think they're going to prove it with Superman Legacy. They claim that they want a Superman that's optimistic, that's smiling, saving cats from the trees in the red underwear. And they're going to get all of that. And it's going to perform less than Man of Steel. It's definitely, that's what's going to happen. And they're going to prove Superman Returns all over again because that was what they wanted and they didn't show up for it. So I really don't know what currently in this current climate, there's the whole, the check boxes, the agendas, where putting an attractive actress as a front role is almost a little bit, it's becoming more and more rare, right? They're putting different actors in these lead roles you can't have the attractive male or female lead as much because they have to hit a certain representation that they think the audience wants to see. And I think now audiences are finally starting to push back on that. The pendulum is starting to swing to where they're getting tired of what they asked for years. Yeah. And so it's starting to swing the other direction, but I really could not answer what the audiences want. I think what they need is to be challenged continually because, as was said earlier, when they're giving movies that are forgettable, that aren't spoken about, these are the safe bets like Ant-Man. That's not what they need. You know, they might be asking for a cheeseburger, but they actually need broccoli, honestly. And it's better for them. And it's better for them. And they talk about it. They're still talking about Zack's films many years down the line. And no one's talking about most of the MCU films. So I think to answer that, that's what the audience needs is to be pushed by the elevation of the medium.
I would also say that the audience, I think, is more likely to watch something if they feel that it is a departure or if it's an outlier. Like if they feel that something is trying to talk down to them or it's going to try to ruin their childhood or undermine or deconstruct, quote unquote, what they really think in their mind is to destruct. The deconstruct just translates once it enters their ear canal and goes into their gray matter. They hear it as destruct, but deconstruct any of their characters or IPs or whatnot. Those are all the things that they are very wary of. And I think that like one thing that really stood out to me was the Sonic the Hedgehog, the redesign of that. So I've talked about this on podcasts before, but basically my opinion about that, it sounds quite contrarian, right? Because, he had the kind of the thin hair and the very human teeth from the animal, body or whatnot. It looks a little bit garish. And I do admit, at the same time, we didn't really see the entire movie with that model. And we also didn't see the models of Tails or Knuckles that would have gone alongside that. So there was a vision for that movie that included a different, like people think, they just changed Sonic and that's all they did. But in reality, they were hustling to change all kinds of things to make sure that this new Sonic fit into that movie without looking as though it's an outlier. Like it's this weird thing that was just added in afterwards. But those are things that people don't talk about. They just talk about how Paramount was a hero for, for listening to the fans. And yet the reason why that movie did so well was just due to the fact that people felt as though they were being listened to, right? And that was a refreshing, different, and kind of like I guess you could say like a subversive thing to do compared to what the relationship they had with the studios beforehand was. So what James Gunn is trying to do right now, especially with all the talk that he's been doing on social media, is to feel like, oh, I'm a man of the people. Like I'm listening to you. Like, like I'm on the same level as you guys. I do think that's what people actually want. I 100% don't think it's what they need. I honestly think that creatives and the audience need to separate. No more at writer's room anymore on Twitter. Like no more of this. Like,
yeah,
creatives need to make their content genuinely, and they need to have a person that kind of goes between the audience and them to kind of translate what the audience is saying, not listening straight from the audience's mouth. Whether their desires are misaligned from that of the studios, it's hard to say. I mean, I think I don't know why studios like Paramount actually changed Sonic to begin with. Like that's crazy. Like,
yeah,
who would actually listen? That's never really happened before. Why did it happen then, and why isn't it happening all the time? Yeah,
that was one of the things that when that happened, I said it here on the show and years ago when it happened, I was against the change. And not because it looked better or worse, the design, I will say, looked closer to the comic book thing. But I'm like, look, if we're about artistic integrity, why are we forcing this change from this artist that designed, maybe director that helped design this version of the character? Why are we forcing that change? And I had refused to watch it. I didn't go to theaters to see the Sonic movie because of that. So this was a studio forcing a changing directions from an artistic vision, and it looked
this came from the audience. But this
that was the
producer.
Weird part. Yeah.
Yes.
It wasn't
exactly.
producer. It was an audience change. So that's the unique part about it. And I don't think it makes it any better personally.
No, it doesn't. I agree.
But
that's an extremely controversial take that you just made, because
I know because it ended up being right. It ended up being the right decision, apparently. And I don't know how many of those audience, although I don't know how many of those people that complained about the design would have truly not gone
anyway.
Yeah, would have seen it anyway. Or how many of them went, well, because they listened to us, now I'm going to go see it. We can't quantify that at this point anymore. If they had just moved forward with the design anyway and people like the movie, people forget that the fucking characters are aliens in the movie. And just 10 years ago, we were whining about the turtles being aliens, and that was a big problem for Michael Bay. But the Sonic characters are literally called aliens in the films and in the Knuckles show, but that's all right. It's just wild to me.
Yeah. And here's, I mean, this is getting a little bit off the point, but I think we're trying to talk about, like, the large aspect of creative integrity and all that. It's possible that they had multiple iterations of Sonic, and maybe they had worked on that version of Sonic, but they didn't like totally flush it out. And they decided to go to this version of Sonic. They put it out on a trailer. They were able to respond quick enough to where they were able to go back to one of the other unfinished versions, kind of flesh that out, and then put that out. So basically, they could have had a situation where the movie was kind of made so that way this Sonic or the previous original version, the trailer version, were both in the movie and could work, right? Because people didn't seem to think about, I still don't think they think about how much design of a character plays into everything. Like, oh, the character looks this way because of the world that he lives in, and because of his history, and because of everything that was in it. It's not just some arbitrary shape. The design is a part of the story itself, and you can't just change a character's design without having an effect on everything else.
Exactly true.
So the fact that it was able to work as well as it did makes me think that one of two things. The first thing that I just said, where this version was kind of also made, and maybe it was even almost finished or something like that. or two, they had both ready to go. They legitimately kind of got ahead of this. They posted the one that people disliked, and then they posted the one that people did like, so that way they could be the heroes for fixing their mistake. Now, that one is a little too far out of a controversy for it to probably be plausible, but I don't know. I mean, we're going to be talking about AI next, so.
Well, I'll quickly answer your theory there. It's they hired a Sonic artist following the backlash of the trailer, and he went in and he's talked about it on X since, but he went in and he redesigned the character to look more like the comic and the video game version, and that's what they ended up going with. But I don't know if you know, but my friend Justin, Sonic Treasure Hunting Sonic, he's a Sonic merch collector. There's a bunch of merchandise that was already done and produced with that old design. I go through his Sonic movie collection, and it's the old design. They didn't have time to change it and update it.
So it was legitimate.
It was legitimate. There's a popcorn bucket, all that stuff. I'm like, that's the old design, the plush, old design. So they didn't have the time to change all the merch, unfortunately. But it's kind of funny to me, which goes to show that there is a cut, I'm sure, of the original Sonic design somewhere out there, probably the original Tails design that never came out. And I would have liked to have seen it.
Well, if that is the case, then that does mean that perhaps to a certain extent, the original design was kind of arbitrary. Because when actually watching the movie, the new design of the character fits in very well, especially when you go to, what is Sonic's world called? It's not coming to my head.
Green Hill Zone?
Yes, Green Hill Zone. Especially during Green Hill Zone, the version of the Sonic that we see fits in very, very well with the aesthetic there. But I couldn't really picture it fitting in with the previous Sonic. So, that's interesting. I don't really know what to say about that, but let's go ahead and move on. I think we talked a lot about audience, and we talk about audience expectations all the time, so it's not anything new. Now, something that is kind of new is AI, and that brings us into part number 8, which is the role of artificial intelligence. So we had this whole Writers Guild of America strike that happened lately, and not to mention we have OpenAI and ChatGPT, which I think they're the same actually, right?
Yes.
OpenAI does Chat, yeah. And we have the one with the video. There's been controversies about AI in regards to art and filmmaking and all these different kinds of animation and these kinds of artistic outlets. And both audiences, small creators, as well as large companies, and the people who write and have different kinds of jobs for these studios all have different reasons to be concerned or perhaps to be excited about what AI could do for them. So I kind of wanted to touch on some of these things from different angles. What do we think that the perspective of directors, actors, writers for these studios are when it comes to AI? What the perspective of the audience is, and what are your own personal opinions?
So I think that the people working in the current people working in trying to write these things and direct these things are very much against AI because it means so many things for them. It means a loss of jobs. It means the copying of their work, previous work that they may have worked on, that this is all pulling from. But audiences, as much as they say, future writers, directors are going to be AI writers and directors. I'm not saying that AI themselves are going to be the directors or the writers, but there's going to be someone who's going to prompt an original film, quote unquote original, from AI, and they're going to put it up on YouTube or whatever, and it's going to be fucking massive. Because I don't think audiences, as much as they say they care about AI, again, we're talking about general audience, like you said, the person that goes up to the marquee, says, I want to see that one movie, has no idea who directed it or what the thing was behind it, the movement, anything. They just want to see a cool looking film. And when they see a trailer, because AI is going to get good enough to where you can't tell anymore the funky fingers or anything like that, when it gets good enough to where they can put together an AI movie or trailer, they're just going to say, that looks pretty good. And even the voices and the writing's going to be all AI. And they're going to go see it. They don't give a shit. They want to be entertained. And if it looks good, they're going to go see it. So I think very easily 10 years down the line, in about a decade, we're going to be in that era of people that used to say they're against AI are going to accept it because, face it, there are some benefits to it. There's time cost, time changes. There's brainstorming, writer's block that's easily solved. You can use it as a template for many things, just like Photoshop. It's Photoshop all over again. The replacing the pencil or pen by using a digital tool. This one's more advanced than any of that. So I think that's the direction we're going to go in. Separate from my opinions on it is I think what's going to happen. And audiences are not going to boycott an AI film. I think they're going to go see it, and studios are going to go, great, that cost us a lot less to make than to hire all these people to put together all those animations. Let's keep making AI films. That might even, it might not be cinema anymore to a lot of people, but that might in some ways save the movie industry. If it becomes that much cheaper to make, just like it's happening with video games, whatever brings the cost down will save that thing.
Do you think we'll see in Hollywood of actors, directors, and writers who are willing to embrace AI versus ones that don't?
Yes. Yeah, it's going to happen. I think it's going to be younger writers and directors, but you just wait for that one old school guy that comes out and says, hey, I'm for it. Like, I'm just waiting for that first big name to say, yeah, it's a good tool. I use it or something. It's going to happen. It's going to be a huge controversy too.
Hey, Martin Scorsese will be long dead by that time, but
yeah.
But he'll be turning in his grave. Don't worry.
Not cinema.
Oh goodness!
He'd argue that cinema's been dead.
Yeah. I would say this: there are two things to consider. Okay, you could say that audiences will love AI because AI is able to give them what they want, or the audiences will not like AI because AI is unable to give them what they want. Now, you didn't quite point this out as much, but I feel like I have the same kind of idea that you do, that audiences do want what AI can give them. And a lot of that is because they only want, they're not thinking like abstract about this, Right. It's not about any of the higher concepts of the themes. It's about kind of making things look like what it's supposed to be, sound kind of like what it's supposed to be. If you could take Superman 1, 2, and 3 scripts and throw it into an AI and generate a Superman 4, kind of doctor up a little bit so it doesn't seem so similar, you can get an actor who looks kind of like Christopher Reeves, but then use AI, like real-time AI CGI, to like change his face and his physique a little bit to look more like Christopher Reeves, and then say Chris is back,
Right.
And you can get, John Williams back on as a musician, and you could do all these different kinds of things to kind of try to reignite the fire, bring back the magic or whatever, so to speak. Now, I think people will like that because they just want to be comforted, basically. And I think that kind of familiarity will comfort them. And it will feel as though there's a lot of animosity towards individuals, towards actors, towards directors, and for good reason, because they're douchebags, and a lot of the actors and directors and the writers who have gotten their way with a lot of movies, in my opinion, have done pretty terrible things with them. Even if we're not talking about Marvel or DC, I think that their sensibilities aren't very reverent of the characters that they're dealing with. And I think as a fan of a lot of these franchises, I do want to see them done well. I want to see reverence paid to them. I want people to take them seriously, to actually write them in such a way where it's assumed that these characters have inherent value, instead of trying to play off the idea that, oh, isn't it kind of absurd that this character flies around pointy ears in the Batcave? I guess that's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, let's just kind of mention that in the movie or whatever. If AI neutralizes all of the human aspects, including the rough around the edges ones that none of us like, I think in the end of the day, that will make people happy. And it's funny, I've been listening to like a lot of YouTube videos about, dissent about current state of pop culture and whatnot. And a lot of them are saying, hey, if AI is going to kick all these people out, good riddance. Like I invite our AI overlords because I'm so tired of the current status quo. So if they feel like this is like a rejection of those kinds of people, then very well the culture could accept AI. But then I think that some of the downsides will be apparent and they will come to fruition. But I think by that time it'll probably be too late.
Yeah. And one of the big downsides, and it kind of goes into your outline here of what do I personally think, is up to a certain point, there won't be like all the quote unquote original ideas, because everything has pulled from something. Like Star Wars is pulled from something, everything is pulled. But the things that would create something new for AI to pull from, like those are going to be few and few. We wouldn't have had a George Lucas, and if he were born today, like he couldn't make his Star Wars movie in the world of AI. So we're going to be missing a lot of those directors and writers, and we're never going to see their projects, unfortunately. But hey, we're going to see someone one day, if we don't get Justice League 2 and 3, they're going to make it with AI. And it probably won't be Zack.
Yeah, that's funny how that works. In principle, I don't like it. I think that there is something. I'm not so material as to believe that the only things that make up the art that we see is just the zeros and the ones that form the letters, that form the colors, the pixels. I feel like there's more to it than that. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's some true inherent eternal value to art. And I think that AI obfuscates and all of those things to the point where it is just what you see, what you get. And I feel like it just feels kind of imminent, kind of apparent that there's something that's not quite right about that I'm certain will come to fruition, will make itself apparent only after we've lived out that reality for long enough. Like it's like when streaming has been out for a while, and then we kind of realize, like, oh snap! When the internet has been out for a while, like, oh snap! It's only years after 2020 and the lockdowns happened that we realize all the damage that it caused. And I'm sure the same thing will be with AI. I mean, will it have its benefits? I guess so. But it's funny that I'm a 30-year-old boomer. It's like
absolutely, yeah, and that's what it's going to be. My son Leo's probably going to grow up in that era of AI where he can make whatever little movie he wants, plug it into his computer, and it'll make it for him, and that'll be his entertainment.
Well, I hope that he enjoys it, Dan. I hope that he enjoys it.
Yeah, all right. That thing is.
Let's go ahead and get into our final part, which is the future of cinematic storytelling. So we've talked about a lot of things. We talked about mergers. We talked a little bit about streaming platforms at the end there, audiences, like what they prefer, and just all the different aspects of what has changed the culture of these big IP franchises and what's gone into all of that. So after everything is said and done, I guess the best question is, are you looking forward to anything? Are you optimistic, or what are your feelings?
At the current state, I am not optimistic. I'm not looking forward to a whole lot. Ever since the Snyder Cut stuff happened, a movie like, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, The Battinson, if we had gotten Justice League 2 and 3, I would have watched it. Would I have liked it? I don't know. But I would have at least watched it. Joker 2, I would have watched it. But now the way things are and how resentful I am towards these companies, and not just Warner Brothers Discovery or AT&T, but also Disney, because they had a huge part in all of this, I don't want to see their movies. I don't want the things that I normally would have been like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like I've said this before, 10 years ago, if I had told me they're going to make a Batman movie that you're not going to be excited for, I would have been like, bullshit, who the fuck are you? And now that's where I'm at. I'm not excited for a Batman movie or its sequel. I'm not excited for a Joker movie. Even though I like Todd Phillips, I can't be excited for Joker 2 because of all the things that have happened since and what continues to happen, where that money's going to go, who it's going to fund. So for me personally, no, I'm not excited for much of anything. I guess the next Denis Villeneuve movie, the next Nolan film, whatever Zack does next, but it's very few things. I'm not as optimistic or like, let me go check that out because whatever. The Fast and Furious movies, that's an exception. Like that's one I'm excited. I'll watch all of those, but it's much less today than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And whether or not things are getting better or worse, I think the audiences they're still going to need to watch something. They're still going to. And right now they're drifting more towards television and streaming. So that's what's succeeding right now, more, in particular Netflix. The things are going to continue to consolidate because there's not enough money to go around. They're finding out there's too many streaming services for audiences. They can't all exist and be successful. So they're going to consolidate. They're going to merge. Audiences are going to keep Netflix forever. And that's going to be one of the places where they're going to continue to watch. As far as theatrical, that's to be seen still, but I'm still going to be one of those dinosaurs that prefers the big screen over the small screen. But I will admit, things like Fallout, I'm like, fuck, television's amazing right now. It's been really strong. Like, that's one thing that hasn't MCU-ified itself or whatever, hasn't watered itself down. And the last thing I told Kelly, and I'll close with this part of it, is, things like the era of There Will Be Blood and Moneyball and, those years where the Oscar movies or whatever were like all massive fucking hitters, 310 to Yuma, that kind of shit. That hasn't happened in a long time. So even like the quality of cinema overall has gone down, unfortunately, but it goes in waves though. I hope things do get better. And if it's on streaming, then so be it. I'll watch there. I
would say that video games have and will probably continue to be the place where cinematic storytelling does find its home. I think that for whatever reason, video games don't have quite the same kind of cultural kind of requirements. Like, I think one reason it's kind of similar to TV. Like, for whatever reason, like TV, you can take an IP, whatever it is, and you can make them a little bit more straightforward, serious, and less ironic, less more marvelized. Mm-hmm. And it's okay for some reason. Like Daredevil was allowed to happen. And they even kind of did that crappy Teen Titans TV show. And they had a few other, like, there was another one, I forgot what it was, like a few other DC projects that were on HBO Max that were more serious. Even Peacemaker, while it's as goofy as it is, has like some serious moments. But there are a lot of things that they won't really, that aren't as common to see in, they have like the Penguin, HBO. So there's a bunch of stuff, right? But I think it's because they kind of suspect that people will be able to watch on their own terms and they have more control over when they pause it, if they want to turn it off, if they want to leave. So people feel more comfortable exploring things and being more comfortable because there's a safety net. I think video games kind of shares that a little bit, although you are paying $70 or more for a game. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, it is still an isolated experience, especially the storytelling games, which are typically one player games. So they allow you to go into these stories much more earnestly than you would with a big blockbuster movie where they kind of want the kids and the parents to be there. Mm-hmm. They've all taken a trip. They've all paid $13 per ticket to go see the movie plus concessions. And they really can't afford anything crazy or controversial or challenging to happen because it's going to ruin their day, basically. So video games allows you to have a longer form, epic, cinematic, and then you even get to be interactive with it as well. So I would say video games is where cinematic storytelling is going to be. And as far as like my optimism for the future of movies, what I will say is there are movies that come out that do interest me or excite me. Mm-hmm. Personally, I've completely abandoned the idea of superheroes specifically, but also just a lot of the big IPs like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and whatever. Yeah. Whether it's TV or movies, I've completely abandoned it. If it has big enough cultural sway, then it probably is going to be used for nefarious ends. So
right.
So I'm not really all about that, but yeah, we'll have to see what the future holds. But I think there will always be something for people who like to enjoy a certain kind of like sophisticated, deep storytelling platform.
Arcane season 2's coming, man.
Oh my goodness, amazing! I didn't even get to say anime is just popping. It's always popping. Anime is amazing, and I'm so happy. Join the Ronin Council. Follow us at Rona Council. Check out the podcast. It's really great. I'm working on a podcast actually right now that I just recorded with Cranberry about what do we just do? I've been so busy lately. Freyrin, Beyond Journey's End. So another serious, unironic story, which a lot of you guys might enjoy. So, well, we covered the entire gamut in 9 parts. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on?
No, as always, there's parts of this that could have been its own episode on its own. But as far as touching on the idea that this could have been an intentional thing by Disney, and we touched into a lot of great ideas that you had brought up on Discord. So I'm fully satisfied.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, guys. The whole gamut of Warner Bros. And Disney. Dan, do you have any places where people can reach out to you? They can find you on socials, things like that?
Absolutely. Head on over to thereasonsimbroke.com and you will find a link to everywhere you can find us, including X, Facebook, Instagram. That's once again at thereasonsimbroke.com.
Okay. Thank you. And you can find me at The Reasons I'm Broke Discord. I'm typically on there. You can find me at the Exiles Net Discord. Definitely check out the article that I wrote on my Substack. My Substack is millennialmike.substack.com. That's millennialmike.substack.com. I wrote an article called Pop Culture Wars, as I mentioned a few times throughout the podcast. That article covers a grand effect on the directions of the studios and some things that people don't always tend to talk about. You can find me also on patreon.com/the Exiles Network. Once this gets uploaded, it'll go on there as a public episode. You can also listen to it on the Reason I'm Broke podcast channel as well on the same day. We're going to line it up, and we'll give you some more details about that on all of our socials. You can find me at Twitter at the Exiles Net on Twitter. Those are the big places for now. Anything else will be in the show notes, and I think we've pretty much covered it. So thank you so much, guys, for listening. We really appreciate your guys' attentiveness. However you manage to listen to this, we really appreciate it if you come all this way. And we'll catch you in the next one. Take care.